A very warm welcome to all of you and thank you on behalf of Informate. We are delighted to welcome our panelists, starting off with Mr. Blair Lucas, co-founder and Chief Executive Officer of Acclaim Australia, Ms. Mariam Reza, Chief Executive Officer of Wattleshire Australia, Mr. Raj Deepan, Tax and Business Advisory Partner at Grant Thornton Australia, Mr. Rajiv Chinnaya, Chief Executive Officer of Koti, ANZ, and this session is moderated by Mr. Jahan Perinpanayagam, Chief Executive Officer of Informate and Vice President of the John Keells Group. Thank you and enjoy this webinar.
Thank you very much indeed, Vinu. And thank you all for being a part of this wonderful panel. The pandemic has had significant impact on so many aspects of life and on so many industries, from education to retail to travel. But what of the accounting industry? Today, I'm honored to have a brilliant, dynamic, humorous, and very futuristic panel of thinkers. We have a CFO, a partner, and two CEOs, each of them brilliant in their own right. So I would like to begin with a set of opening statements from each of the panelists on the post-pandemic challenges from the perspective of finance professionals. What are the changes and what are the opportunities? Mariam, if we could start with you.
Oh, really happy to be here. Thank you, Jahan, for inviting me, and thanks, Vinu, as well, for all of the work that you put in behind the scenes to set up the webinar. Really glad to be on this panel, especially standing among the shoulders and above the shoulders of giants. So thank you, all of you, for being such an incredible panel, and really excited to be here. So a post-pandemic world, and what does it mean to accountants? Fundamentally, just depends on what type of accountant you are as well, fundamentally. And I know that this is a very broad stroke type thing, but we all are in some shape and form connected to the accounting industry, but we all come at different angles. Are we a consultant? Are we a generalist? Are we a specialist? Are we part of a large blue chip company, or are we an accountant in a small medium term practice? So our challenges, just like how COVID impacted our personal lives, affect us differently as an accountant and also in the accounting profession fundamentally as well. But it also affects us from a generational point of view as well, in terms of where are we at in the stages of our career, and where are we at in terms of our own personal circumstances as well. So when you think about the COVID crisis or the pandemic that affected us, fundamentally it changed what it meant to do business. Our business models changed, how we approach technology changed, technology itself changed the way we approach business. So fundamentally a lot of changes, and ultimately comes down to how equipped are we to deal with this change, to deal with the disruption that comes our way. And if it wasn't the pandemic, it was going to be something else. It's always an oil crisis or a recession or a Great Depression. Ultimately, it fundamentally comes down to how equipped are we to deal with the change, regardless of post-pandemic or any other change that comes in, to be able to fashion and deal with a lot of the change. So the accounting industry did see a lot of changes. I'd say predominantly, I know that my fellow panelists will speak about the different aspects, but from my angle, and I speak quite a lot about the intergenerational elements, so the workforce angle, how it impacted the accounting industry is succession planning, talent pipeline. How did we approach, because our business models changed significantly as well, we then, when you look at your talent pipeline, it was disrupted significantly, where that linear pathway changed, but fundamentally as well, business models changed. So where you thought a sector was booming, you went into that sector, suddenly disruption, switch back to something else, switch back to something else. What am I talking about here? I'm talking about agility of you as a person, an accountant, in the profession that is accounting, that is also changing. So to summarize it all up, what does it mean to be an accountant in a post-pandemic world? Are we equipped and fit to ride the wave that is coming, but also pivot for the disruption that comes our way? And that's what it means to be an accountant in a post-pandemic world. Thanks, Jahan.
Thank you very much indeed. How equipped are we? How agile are we? Thank you, Mariam. And if I could now move on to Blair. Blair, would like to hear your perspective as a CEO, as a founder working in different parts of the world.
Thanks, Jahan. And I won't go into detail, just thank everybody, because otherwise we'll spend all our time thanking everybody, but thank you anyway. To everybody who's done all of the great work to set this up, I'm honored to be here. I do suspect that coming behind Mariam like this is going to be challenging, because not only does she present very, very eloquently some of the challenges and opportunities, but she doesn't leave you with much to go on. But the one thing I can say, which is different, is that I'm not an accountant. I can barely add up. So the opportunity or the perspective that I can provide here is less so about the challenges specifically facing the profession, but more the challenges in dealing with accounting in a business. And from my perspective, I employ a lot of accountants. And so what we are seeing through this period is obviously that COVID has created a lot of challenges, but in doing so, it's also created an awesome number of opportunities. And to dwell upon Mariam's use of that word agility or agile, I think that's critical here. What it has demonstrated, or what COVID has demonstrated, and I can talk about this forever, is that in fact we need to be much more flexible and agile, much more startup-y in how we approach the way we deliver our services, the way we deliver our accounting solutions, in order to move with a world that is moving and changing very, very quickly. So I can't tell you what you need to be an accountant very much in that way, but I can certainly tell you that if you're running a business that deals with accounting, either internally or the provision of those accounting services, then being able to adapt your model to suit a world that does not have a clear path going forward is certainly the way to meet this challenge that we face.
Thank you very much indeed. How do accountants deliver our services to the world? Thank you very much. Next, we have Raj Deepan. Raj, we'd love to hear your perspective coming from Grant Thornton from a regulatory statutory point of view, as well as an audit perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Jahan. So I've been in the profession for 30 years. I started when I was about 10 years old, so I'm 40 now. So that's you know how old I am. The biggest change for me was that in the 30 years that I've been working, I always thought going to work was getting up in the morning, putting on my suit and traveling into work. And my wife would say to me, why do you do this? And why do you go at 7 a.m. in the morning and you come back at 10 p.m. at night? And I miss spending time with my daughter. And we're always fighting. So as soon as I come home, my wife and I are fighting and it's a bit of a disaster and then we start again. So COVID hit March last year and we were all forced to work from home. And it was a revelation for me, the fact that we could work from home. And we transitioned. In Australia, we have 1,200 people. Globally, we have 55,000 people, including about 200 people in Sri Lanka. And we said to all our people in Australia, go and work from home. And we work in five divisions, including audit. And we're getting into a busy period, March, April, and June is our financial year end. And we made that switch in one day. You know, everybody went home, started working from home, right? Our technology worked, we did things seamlessly. We thought the pandemic is going to now crash, the world is going to end, right? It's going to be a disaster. I know people have suffered, but you know, we held up pretty well. You know, we've been now, 15, 16 months since the pandemic hit. And depending on the industry you're in, I mean, tech, for example, I'm in tech. Tech has really done well. I mean, I don't know if you guys read that the guy who invented this system that we're on, Zoom, his value in Zoom went up by $4 billion in a month, right? So because everybody was on Zoom. And I was like, we were actually zoomed out. There were a lot of Zoom calls happening. And the other main thing was collaboration. Right? We were all, trying to collaborate, and collaboration is a big word in the accounting profession, because we're going into a period, or when I started 30 years ago, I was just a generalist. I could do audits, I could tick with my green pen, and it was all good. But the future is all about specializing and collaborating. So we found that the pandemic aided people to collaborate better, because it didn't matter where you were. I could speak to you, Jehan, in Sri Lanka. I could speak to a colleague in Melbourne or whatever. So it has aided collaboration. So to me, those are the big learnings, the fact that we can work remotely, work from home, right, and look after our families and get a bit of better life balance, and actually go to work when you want to. Most of our people are going to work 2 days a week, and then also to collaborate better, because when you're collaborating now, I can collaborate with anybody. So I can pick up the phone to you, Jehan, I can get on a Zoom call with you. So it's going to aid collaboration in the future. So I'm a positive. I see the pandemic has been positive. Obviously, lives have been lost, and we need to manage that. But coming out of this, I think the world is going to be a better place. So those are my learnings.
So listening to you, I get a picture of the new accountant, someone who's very optimistic, talking of collaboration. These were things that accountants were not known traditionally for, and for the great sense of humor. Thank you for that. And next we have a CFO. Rajiv, it will be very, very interesting to hear a CFO's perspective on the post-pandemic challenges. Thank you.
Thanks, Jehan. Really happy to do it. Meaning meaning I've gone through so much change over the last 18 months or so. So I work for a global fragrance and cosmetics business. Obviously, having the pandemic, obviously with face masks and all the restrictions that there were, that industry was impacted heavily. And we, as being in the finance profession, had to then guide the business through change. So, I've heard all the stories and they're very true. But being in the industry, we've got other challenges as well. And one of our main challenges that we had was real-time data. And as the board was looking for information on, what are competitors doing, what are our products doing in the market, what new channels are there, we had to come up with new information and new data. And that was a challenge because we may not have been set up internally in that environment. We had to manage cash flow. Cash flow was huge. We had to protect our employees over that time, but also work with our suppliers to make sure that we pay on time, and also then with our customers to ensure that we collect as well. And the other key challenge that we saw was that with the fast tracking of e-commerce, there were new channels coming into play. And if you weren't ready to play in those channels, you were missing out. So for example, when most of our factories in Europe went into lockdown, we had to stop actually making perfumes and make hand sanitizers as an option. And if we didn't do that, we had to lay off our employees. So, those were some of the challenges that we faced. Internal controls was massive because there was the expectation that where we were trying to be flexible within the business, we still had to maintain our internal controls and be SOX compliant. From an actual opportunities perspective, it made us actually focus a lot more on actual data automation and systems planning. So we went into scenario planning, how do we work in uncertain times? And that was great because we had to reskill. Also with employees and teams working from home, there were opportunities for us to rent save. And we actually worked on new cost baselines. So that was good as we managed our actual cash. And then e-commerce, obviously, being able to have the product online, be able to accept payments and actually speed to market. They were all crucial parts of the opportunities that we actually took over the last 18 months or so.
Fascinating. So online information, quick decision making, cash flow planning, scenario planning, fascinating. Thank you very much, Rajiv. So we have our first rapid fire round. And Raj, I would like to start with you. From an audit and assurance aspect, what are the specific changes auditors need to cope with? And what are the changes in methodologies and procedures that you foresee? Because sadly, physical audits could be impacted. Assets are in remote locations. You have new cyber threats that Rajiv spoke of. How will the scope and the nature of audit and assurance change?
Yeah, I think I'm not in audit, right, Jehan? I used to be in audit for my first 6 or 7 years, but I was on my audit colleagues. But talking to them, the biggest challenges, I guess, in terms of actually doing the audit, there's a lot of automation, right, coming in. And I know Sri Lanka is doing stuff on this, right? RPA, robotic process automation, AI is coming in. So that's happening. So we're going back to how we used to do audits when I started in audit, which was 1990, right? And at that time, it was about the partner or the manager using their discretion, right? And I think Rajiv touched on SOX and so on. And when that was brought in, it became more a process-oriented audit, whereas now we're going back to judgment, right? So it's knowing your client, understanding the industry they're in, and like Jehan articulated there, the challenges at Kori, right? So we understand that. Talking to Jehan, we would understand that. Then we would expect to see that in the results, right? So that's one thing, is that we're going back to that face-to-face, maybe not face-to-face physically, but remotely, right? And all the audit work itself being done using technology. A lot of the testing and all that sort of stuff that we used to tick and bash will be done by testing. and the auditor using his sort of discretion and his understanding of the industry to actually add value to the client beyond just doing a historical audit. So the auditor's role now is more about the future, because and the future is changing rapidly. So no longer are we setting strategies, our clients setting strategies for years ahead. The strategies are very agile, they're changing all the time. So the auditor is playing a part of that, making sure we are independent, right? But we're still playing a part in that. So that's the key thing. And I'll talk about, maybe there might be another question later, Jahan, but the audit firms, there are some independence issues coming into audit firms as well. Back to the big four, we are number 5. The big four is heavily under scrutiny in Europe and in the UK, because they've grown back their consulting practices. So between them, they do like $120 billion in fees. And a lot of that is coming from advisory work. So we think the profession is under pressure to split out the advisory components of it because of independence reasons. And there'll be some opportunities and challenges coming out of that. But it's really, we are looking for young professionals, if they're on the call, young accountants, it's about, learning the industries that your clients operate in and adding value beyond the audit. That is the future. And using technology, with collaboration to do the groundwork.
Thank you very much. Rajiv, from a CFO's perspective, what are the changes you expect to see in the CFO's role? What new expectations are there of the CFO, and what attributes will a CEO and a board look for in a new CFO post-pandemic?
Thanks, Jahan. So the CFO has been and will always be the custodian of the financial risk and actually governance aspects of the organization. But what we're seeing a lot more now is that we are also expected to scenario plan and predict the future. We're expected to be 2 steps ahead in periods of uncertainty. And whilst forecasting, budgeting will always remain, we will need to scenario plan, and it'll be an important aspect of what we do. We will also need to, build business resilience amongst the teams. We will need to coordinate with our sales, with the commercial teams, with the operational teams, and actually lead through change and through, all these new business realities that are present in the market. And, of most important is to protect cash flow and cost reduction and cash management. Whilst we control our cash, but also making sure that we've got enough funding to grow the business in the future, whilst we take the opportunities. Basically, from a new expectations perspective, we feel that ensuring that the business is ready for future growth and creating long-term value will be important. So, heavily involved in the strategy of the business and making sure that we collaborate both amongst our teams, but also regionally, globally, and making sure that the communication is at a very strong level. We'll need to focus on automation. There's no way that we can hide behind that. We'll need to be able to, as new virtual markets open up, there were new buyers, there were new sellers coming into the markets. We'll actually need to play in those markets. And what I also feel from a CFO perspective is we'll need to upskill and or reskill because of these new technologies. We'll need to bring our skill levels up, and not only for the CFOs, but for the rest of the finance team. From an actual attributes perspective, definitely what I can see is that, the CEO or the board will require us to be forward thinkers, and that's the continuous planning aspect of it, being actually creative. And by being creative, what I mean is that we find solutions to some of the problems that actually come. And we'll need to drive all the automation and digital transformation that goes forward, meaning we'll need to be agile and we'll need to be savvy in the whole process. And I think what's also important is we'll have to attract and retain talent, and create forward-looking teams in the future.
The sense that I get, it's going to become a very, very exciting role. I heard the the words that you spoke: strategy, collaboration, communication, automation, technology, attracting talent. So it's going to be a completely different finance professional by what you shared. Interesting. Mariam, you speak to students and young members from student perspective and from the perspective of young professionals, finance professionals. What should they do to adapt to the new normal? What new skills, new methodologies, new attitudes do they need to learn to thrive in the new normal?
It's an interesting question, Jahan, and I might actually build off of what Raj and Rajiv mentioned as well, because you've effectively already outlined a playbook of the skills that are required for the emerging talent, so to speak, in the accounting industry. And I agree 100% around judgment type accounting in terms of the way we approach business, in terms of, and Rajiv, you were mentioning scenario planning, creativity and forward thinking outlook. And there's a lot of emphasis that both of you touched on, and also Blair initially spoke about as well, around automation and data and the importance of adopting technology. But fundamentally, whenever we talk about data and technology, people sort of are against it just because there is this negative connotation associated with data and technology, with loss of jobs, insecurity and instability. But what I do want to build on is, based on all those skills there, use that to then make your job easier. But in making your job easier, fundamentally, it doesn't take away from the fundamental underpinning of what makes us function the way we do, which is people. People do business with people. We've heard that before. And post-pandemic, or regardless of whatever disruption comes your way, technology will always be that tool that augments and assists you in enabling that speed and agility that Rajiv was talking about around the different business processes, the different e-commerce models that he had to pivot into. Fundamentally, what doesn't change is the ability for people to engage with people, and Blair touched on this, online collaboration, to be able to then reach across the screens and tap into people. Because what use of technology in an audit, as Rajiv was saying, if you don't know how to tap into that human psychology or the nuances in relationships and people dynamics that you see, and that's not, that doesn't have a playbook. That's more, did somebody scoff at me? Did somebody stare away at the screen? What's going on? Tapping into that. So fundamentally, yes, everything that this panel is talking about is 100% correct, but also people, relationships, leadership, empathy and understanding of those around you, but also of yourself, and creativity. And what this pandemic has taught us, going forward post-pandemic, the importance of your own self-preservation is fundamentally paramount. Because did we not see Osaka pull out of tennis because of mental health reasons? Did we not see some other cases that we've seen with mental health? And what's happening now is, it's important to use the tools. Technology is the tool to get better results, but reaching out to the screen and tapping into people, but fundamentally your core grounding is important as well, not just because of COVID, but going forward, that's going to be paramount and important in the future as well.
Thank you. So the entire people element, not something that featured very high in the list of accountants' priorities some years ago. Amazing how things have changed, and perhaps a change for the better. I mean, we might all end up as far richer human beings in the finance profession. Blair, you are doing some wonderful work in the US, in Australia, and indeed in multiple geographies. And there are obviously large changes from travel restrictions, business continuity, disruptions. What are some of the changes you envisage in advisory and compliance services that you foresee?
Oh, look, I think it's fairly self-explanatory in many respects, but obviously the inability to travel has created both challenges and opportunities in this regard. And if you look at, without blowing our own trumpet, but one of the reasons we were very resilient during the last year or so is because we specialize in setting up virtual companies and providing an entire outsourced solution to our clients who wish to expand globally. Now, of course, that was already our DNA, but that was the necessity during COVID. And that has led people to be less reliant, in my opinion, upon their core team back home, and more willing to trust delegating responsibility, delegating roles to people in other countries whom they may not know, whom they may not have a relationship with. I mean, the mere fact that if you wanted to enter the United States last year, you had to employ a local team. If you needed boots on the ground, you couldn't send, well, you wouldn't want to have sent your team of executive leadership team from back home, nor would they probably want to go. So you were pushed into a situation whereby instead of choosing to use a local team to deliver the services, the work, the performance you wanted, instead of using your own team, you had to use that local team. And that, I think, has softened a lot of attitudes towards such an approach. And I think that's what I find quite fascinating, that it used to, even now as we're coming out of this, people are not saying, fine, we're going to go back to setting up an office in another country and picking a team from here and sending them over. Instead, we're going to recruit locally. Instead, we're going to use outsourced services in these jurisdictions, in these territories, to deliver some of this work that needs to be done. And frankly, like a lot of COVID, it has highlighted where we have deficiencies in our systems. It's highlighted where there are gaps, and it has, to those who are progressive enough to identify and to fill those gaps, that's the opportunity. And so what we've seen, for example, even tonight I was at an event where we were talking about companies from Australia, startups, scale-ups that had scaled into the United States in the last year because they had a technological solution that fit a gap, and that gap was there because COVID had identified it. And they'd done this entire global expansion without ever seeing where they were, where their office was, without ever being on the ground to open a bank account, they were doing it entirely remotely. And I think that's where we'll see some really interesting developments in the ability to be, again, very agile and very quick to move into foreign markets.
Incredible, Blair. So this whole thing may actually accelerate global collaboration, teams working across borders, using each other's talents and strengths. Incredible. Coming to our second round of rapid fire questions, Rajiv, some aspects such as hybrid work arrangements, banking procedures, switching to electronic documentation, are they going to remain? From a controls aspect, in terms of safeguarding the organization assets, preventing fraud, what must the finance professional do to continue to discharge this aspect of his or her responsibility that you touched on when you spoke first?
Yeah, thanks, Jahan. I would strongly say that we go back and review our existing controls. All our business continuity plans and how effective these are in the new ways of working. That's our starting point. Making sure that none of the existing controls are being compromised. But also, we should test any third-party arrangements or any outsourced service providers to see whether they're still able to meet their obligations or if any of their controls have been compromised. I would still say cash is very much king, and ensuring that our cash payments are in place. We've got the right authorizers. We keep the banks informed of any changes in roles, responsibilities, and we actually go back to the basics of what we had done previously that worked. Those should still very much remain. I'm a great advocate of keeping the auditors informed. Having early discussions with the auditors, making sure that there is no surprises at quarter end when we do our reporting or at year end, and actually engaging them up front, and if there are breaches, then we deal with them up front. And I think it's important that we do that. I would think we formally document, especially over the last 18 months where we may have taken shortcuts or we may have done temporary things. We actually document them and retrain our employees, on all aspects of control, over this period where, things have changed. We go back to the drawing board and re-educate the employees. So those were four of the key things that, we should still do in the market, just to make sure that our internal controls are not being compromised. And obviously, the most important of all is a technology risk that we currently face with employees working from home. They may be using their own devices and times that may not have all the secure controls. So making sure that we have policies and processes against those.
Words of warning, I think, very, very timely indeed. Mariam, you've already touched on this, but I'd like to quote Loretta Ross, CPA Australia. I think the most important skill or attribute for a finance professional in a post-COVID world will be the ability to reskill and to adapt to changing circumstances. So you've already touched on this, but what would be the top 3, in your view, new skills the finance professional needs to adopt to thrive?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Rajiv. And I've spoken to Loretta as well. She's a fantastic person at CPA, really big fan of the work that she does. I think the top 3, it's a bit hard, but I think I'm going to follow through on based on everything that the panel has just mentioned as well. But I think being aware, so keeping your ear on the ground and listening to what's going on, because change is not going to come beautifully parceled in a beautiful package. It's about taking change by the horns, but even change for change's sake, having your ear on the ground always, constantly, and knowing what change is going to come to be able to then pivot to it. So it's not necessarily just change for change's sake, but keep your ear on the ground and figure out where we're going with what to be able to change. And I think also, I'm going to go with political acumen as well, figuring out, knowing who, being in the know and knowing who to go to for something. So build your relationships, build your network for political acumen. So knowing who to tap into when that change is happening, because it upends traditional individuals, traditional structures, traditional business processes, knowing who's in the know to be able to get certain things done. So knowing what's happening, what's changing, and also the people to tap into for that. And then possibly the third thing, I'm just trying to think outside the box because I know the panel has incredible answers as well. I'd say also, I'm thinking maybe even going to go with maybe compliance and trust. And this is another thing that I've been hearing the panel talk about with Raj said, going back to judgment, which is thinking about yourself as opposed to process-oriented practices, but also trust as a factor. So being able to build on trust and being honest and ethical as accountant in a time where we may have taken shortcuts, going back to Rajiv's point, but now ironing that out to then have the systems and processes and information in place for the next few 10 to 15 years as well. So the change, the people in play, and also then the trust element, being a good accountant, an ethical accountant to ride that change and ride those people in that change.
Words of wisdom, indeed, a completely new perspective from Mariam. Thank you very much for that. Raj, accountants have a role to play in a business, surviving in the new normal. So we heard about cash is king and about managing your cash flows. What are some of the other important functions in an organization we look to from the accountant, and how can the accountants best add value in these circumstances? Some of these have been touched on, about cash flow, but what are the other areas that you could touch upon, Raj?
Good question, Jahan. When people ask me what I do, the last word I use is accountant, right? I actually don't use that word, even though, I ended up being an accountant. So in the last 15 years, it's really gone, right? So I actually use the word, I'm not sure what I do. I'm like a relationship guy, I'll make up something, right? So that goes back to all these people skills. Accountants need to become advisors, right? Advisors, and they're going to be strategic. So I'm sure Rajiv is doing that. I didn't realize he was a guy who has so much talent. I only used to see him at the pool in Sri Lanka and having beers, but now I see he's a man with all these skills that he's talking about. Yeah. So as a CFO, you're up there, right, with the CEO. But if you look at the trend now as well, having said that, if you look at some of the US companies like Sundar Pichai, for example, was picked as CEO of Google, right? He was not a CFO, right? So the very large companies, dominant companies in the world are picking technology people, the innovators, to become the CEOs, because they think of CFOs as, impediments. They'll sit there and they'll count the numbers and say, you can't do this and you can't do that, and that's risky and this, that. Whereas, so I think the CFOs, need to push the boundaries and get out there. And we do live in a very complex world, right? So because I look after some major accounts around the world, including Facebook. I look after Facebook in the region. It's $1 billion business in Australia. So when it comes to getting things right, it's got to be 100% right. They don't believe in right or gray areas, right? It's got to be 100% right. So it is important that we get the basics right, and we have the systems and the process to do that. But we need to become, risk takers. Accountants need to become risk takers. There's no risk, there's no return. right? And we need to be at the table adding strategic value, right? And to do that, we do need to understand the industry we play in. We need to read, right? If you're in the technology sector or if you're in telecommunications, right? Read about what's happening in telecommunications, right? Otherwise, you're not going to be in the forefront, right? So really be part of the strategy of the business. Obviously, oversee the finance function and delegate it. And I'm sure Rajiv has lots of people, lots of finance managers, good-looking ladies, look after all his work, so he can go around and do all the strategy stuff, right? So yeah, so build a team with a combination of technology and AI and controls and processes. And having said that, and having the real-time data, then get involved in the decision-making of the business.
So the new finance professional is going to be a risk taker, someone who reads, who has his ear to the ground, and someone who is an advisor. Thank you very, very much for that, Blair. From the perspective of mindset, attitude, leadership, and managing people, what would you recommend for the finance professionals? You work with so many finance professionals. What would you like to see in terms of mindset and attitude?
I think if anything, there just needs to be a little bit more humanity. And I don't mean that before I get in trouble with everybody else on this panel. It's not to say you're robotic machines that all you do is stop me spending money, even if that's what CFOs generally do when I want to spend money. Nonetheless, really, I think the interesting part is that accountants, CFOs, professionals in this space do get very deep into their subject matter, their numbers. And they often forget, if that's a better word, or fail to put in context the fact that they are working for people, and that there's an immense value that can be created out of applying a little more, this sounds terrible, but applying a little more humanity to what you do. Remembering that at the end of the day, the numbers connect to a company that connects to people. Remembering that the numbers may not even connect to a company that may connect directly to people. Essentially, although the subject matter may be binary, at the end of the day, it's a very complex space dealing with human emotions. And that I think in my opinion, the best accountants are those who have that ability to bridge that gap between the black and white of the numbers and the hugely gray area of humanity.
Fascinating. You know, when I joined 20 plus years ago, the accountant was someone who was seen as back office, who was not the most liked. It's amazing how it's changed and how the pandemic has accelerated that. Thank you very much, Blair. Coming to round 3, Mariam, what new technologies will most impact the accounting profession? We've heard of bots, data science, blockchain. Which technologies will be most influential and must be mastered by the post-pandemic finance professional?
Interesting. There's technologies of flash. So we have heard of blockchain, we've heard of RPA, we've heard of data processing, all of that. So I'm not going to reinvent the wheel or re-chirp out all of the things that you already know. Fundamentally, I think post-pandemic, building on everything that this panel is talking about, and also the theme, I possibly draw your attention to a very simple thing. How do you engage with people? You engage with people by talking to them, by interacting with them, by moving around in, say, a lunchroom type setting. Now take that online, and then now you have a screen, and it just completely throws everything off balance. We've all been forced to embrace Zoom, but have we mastered it yet is yet to be seen. So fundamentally, I think, quite simply, what are the technologies that we need to influence or understand as accountants? Taking what Blair said, people and humanity, 100% agree, 100%. But now add technology to it, online collaboration, online engagement of an audience on an online platform. To be the best accountant in the world, to make it simple, engage with your people, but make them feel like it's not online, that you're reaching across the screens and touching them in person and engaging with them. And I'm going to take you back to a story as well. When Blair was talking about humanity and accountancy being binary, and also Rajiv is amazing. You're incredible in all of the stuff that you're saying. I'm just actually messaging one of my mates as well, saying, this panel is just awesome in terms of the technical aspects in which we're covering, but also the people element. When I started off in accounting, I started off in forensic accounting, and I was doing this big fraud. It was an internal fraud, as you can imagine. And so we were up against our own people, so to speak. And it was so hard to run a forensic audit in an internal setting. But then I realized the only way we could make inroads was having a coffee with the person, going out for lunch, having a chat with them. And I realized how hard it was. We were going in with big stacks of files and saying, this is, we're awesome, we're great, we're compliance, we're assurance. And it completely closed the door. But the moment you went for coffee and reached out and touched the souls and the work ethic and the people behind it, we were able to make so much inroads that we actually had an insider be able to assist with some of the processes and the fraud. So fundamentally, coming back to your question in terms of technology, take all of that experiences touching the lives of people and bring it onto an online platform through video conferencing, through Zoom platforms, but also online collaboration as well. Because now you're not collaborating with international teams, you're also collaborating with domestic teams and also internal, external, all of that dynamic as well. Long story short, one technology that I feel I would back is learning to engage with people in an online setting as if it were not online.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you very much. Very fresh perspective. Raj, what investments in digital technology are required for accounting firms post-pandemic? You spoke of some of the large investments being made in Australia. And what would be some of the new services and new opportunities for accounting firms?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think, I'll try and keep it brief because I think we're getting close to time. But as I said, touched earlier, we are all going into this advisory space, right? So it's around how can we add value to our clients? So cyber is a big area. We are using a lot of data tools to analyze information, for example, a GST audit or a VAT audit. So what accounting firms are doing is building new products based on technology to take to clients. Because I think there's some stat, I forget exactly what it is, but I think 90% of the data in the world was created in the last 5 years, right? Something like that. So in the next 10 years, it's going to be amazing. Data is going to be 3 or 4 times, right? So everybody is about data insights and data analytics. How can we mine the data? How can we add value? How can we make sure we're compliant, right? And the regulators, I think I might have mentioned earlier, even though we talk about people a lot and engagement a lot, ultimately, we can't forget that we are regulated, right? So Rajiv is regulated. He needs to make sure he complies with the requirements from a governance perspective, from an audit perspective, he's ready. So we just need to make sure that that we get everything done correctly, even though the touch and feel stuff is good, right? So, but that's the challenge, right? Because we say to all our people, be this dynamic people and engage and all these things, but when do they do the work? End up working 16-hour days like I used to work, and the next generation of people don't want to do that, right? So it's just enabling technologies. I think the firms are investing in, and AI is a big part of that. I know the big four have committed to something like $7 or $8 billion between them to invest in AI in the next 4 or 5 years, and that's going to be a major play, right? Because we want to be able to mine data and get the insights and then add value to clients using that data, right? So one of the areas that's growing strongly, Jehan, for us is also around cybersecurity and controls and so on, that I think Rajiv touched on. That's a big area, right? I mean, those guys, my partners in that area, are completely, they've got so much work on. They don't know where it's coming from. They don't know, they can't actually feel, because everybody's scrambling to comply with the regulators, right? And if you're an international business like Cody, right, you have a lot of issues to deal with, right? Regulation is a big part of it. Simple thing as opening a bank account, as you will know, you want to go and open a bank account in Australia, it'll take 6 months now. By the time they do all the checks, and they'll want to know your entire history. If you open a personal bank account, they'll know when was your grandfather born. My grandfather was born in Jaffna, in 1922 or something. When was the last time you did this? So the compliance has gone crazy, right? So we need to be on top of that, but we use technology solutions are being taken by accounting firms to clients to manage that, so they can focus on growing their business.
Thank you very much. So do please start sending in your questions on the Q&A, so we can take your questions. We have a fantastic panel. We have a great audience as well, from Australia, from UAE, and from Sri Lanka. Blair, according to the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales, nearly a third of accountants suffer from mental health issues. Now, that's a very troubling statistic. More than 2 in 5 of accountants believe their job was a key contributor to their poor mental health, with COVID-19 making safety and the health of all employees a key priority. What must accounting firms and leaders such as yourself do to safeguard mental well-being?
Join the club. I think everybody across every industry is experiencing suddenly elevated levels of stress and depression. There's no doubt, but certainly. So I think, whilst I totally understand that within this industry there may have been an increase, I think we can in fact say it's been across the board. I think even absent of COVID, there's been gradually increasing levels of stress, depression, anxiety, etc., in whichever job one works in. And obviously, as an employer, the easiest, best way, and yet the most problematic way to deal with that is communication. And I say most problematic because it's riddled with potential risks in terms of HR and compliance itself and how one does communicate with one's personnel. But what I found interesting during COVID is that it was almost as though the societal rules around us were relaxed a little. It used to be seen as potentially problematic to be asking, an employee, how are they doing, how are things, etc. It had to be crafted or couched within particular language. But COVID almost gave us license to be a little bit more human with each other and to be more honest with each other and really start to inquire as to how people are feeling, what can you do, how can we help? At the same time, it's also allowed us to deploy creative solutions to managing that. There are an immense number of online tech-based solutions that individuals can engage in confidentially. By individuals, I mean employees can engage in confidentially, that they can engage in from a distance. And it's not difficult to deploy them or offer them to the group of your staff as such and allow them to do that. But look, it's a matter of, in my opinion, the easiest way to combat these situations is communication. And that's often, as I said, the most challenging.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Thank you, Blair. Rajiv, the pandemic is essentially acting as a digital accelerator, driving a paradigm shift from brick and mortar to digital ways of work. Any new business models that you envisage?
Yeah, thanks, Jehan. I think what we're seeing now, meaning, is a shift to working from home. The ability for companies to adapt to that and work in a hybrid model, needs to be considered and thought. What this really means is that you don't need to have all your skills based in one location. Despite what we've gone through the 18 months, the world has actually got smaller. And skills now can be shared, and this work from home is likely to exist. And, as a company, we announced a few weeks ago that, from now onwards, you'll only work 50% in the office. So, and that's a fact now. And I think that's a new model that will be created as we go through the next few months. Automation, we actually can't hide around that. Companies will need to automate, and it'll need to be faster and sooner than what it has happened in the past. Certain companies have had to downsize because of the pandemic, but the work hasn't gone away. So you'll need to find, more efficient, quicker ways of doing things. And I think that will be an important shift. Online shopping, the way online shopping we knew of 2 years ago, online shopping still remains, but it will be at the next level, and e-commerce will be, it is such an important model for most businesses, and, most companies will have to start investing, and it will take off even further after the pandemic. And what I think, what I've seen in the industry is that the changing of supply chains and diversification, where supply chains have been impacted heavily due to COVID, due to shipments, delays, distribution, factories closures, companies have had to adapt and have had to diversify. And I think that will continue to actually keep changing in the future.
Thank you very, very much, Rajiv. Any questions from panel, from the audience? what are some ways to keep your team well connected to a remote setting and cater to training needs, especially with new recruits who generally learn on the job? Anyone from the panel would like to take a stab at it? How do you train new people, particularly joining your teams?
I might do a quick answer on that, and then maybe Miriam can. It is a key issue of working remotely, right? Is when somebody new starts, how do you train them? And on-the-job training is always easier in the office. So what we say is we've got a flexible working arrangement, but when a team member starts in a new team, we ask that team to be in the office that week. So at least the first couple of weeks, in terms of induction and so on, hand-holding, showing them where the toilets are, showing them where the computers and the printers are. So we do that, and then we say if there's anything important, like coaching, we talk about coaching being ongoing now. It's no longer you coach 6 months or 12 months. So when there's a coaching catch up, you actually catch up in person, right? Because we prioritize that. But yeah, so it is what you call a flex arrangement, I think, or hybrid, like Rajiv touched on. And but when there's important things, we make sure that team members or coaches are in the office for a face-to-face.
Okay, thank you. We have another question coming through. Given so much of change, what are the plans for reskilling your employees, and will it entail a huge investment? Rajiv or Mariam?
Yeah, if I can take that. I mean, from an actual training perspective, I believe training is super important. And how we train employees, obviously, with the pandemic is different to what we would have trained them in the past. What we do very well within Kurdi is peer-to-peer training. So you actually have a mentor, you actually have a buddy system, and it doesn't need to be in the same country. It could be somebody sitting somewhere else who's done a similar role, who's gone through a similar experience, and you take them through the process. And I think, once again, as I said previously, it's making the world so much smaller, but you're using your existing resources to ensure that everyone is trained and cross-trained. And yes, they can do online training, they can do all other sorts of training, but this type of training where you have the buddy system and you have a mentorship to take you through the process, I think adds so much value to the experience.
Thank you. Mariam, would you like to take this next question? Could you please share any advice for finance undergraduates?
That's a great question. I'd really like perhaps for the individual to specify what type of advice they wanted, because it can be a very open-ended answer. But I think fundamentally, in summary, I know that when you're a finance graduate, all of these words feel like big words. The whole world looks like such a huge boulder that you need to conquer. There's technology, there's RPA, but everybody's got your back. Organizations are there to guide you through that process. Institutions are there to guide you through the process. Your educational institutions are there to guide you through the process. One step at a time. Just look at the change that's going on. We're not saying take on all of the challenges at the same time, just one step of the way. And again, going back to those relationships and the people, align yourself with the right people that'll guide you through that journey and also teach you the right things that you need across the board. So as Rajiv said around the previous questions around peer-to-peer learning, again, we're not saying, spend 6 months learning RPA or spend 10 years learning blockchain and so on and so forth. Things change so much faster. So equip yourself with the right people and the right institutions, the establishment that will assist you through that process, but also be aware of what's changing so that you can pivot to the right things at the right time.
Thank you. Blair, speaking of new business models, one thing the pandemic has taught us that you can work from anywhere, and physical locations no longer is so important. Will this enable more cross-border partnerships where companies leverage global talent for services? They tap into the Philippines for their support with help desk, to India with their lawyers, Sri Lanka with their accounting, and Sri Lanka reaches out to different countries where they need talent. Likewise, do you see that sort of global partnership opening up?
Yeah, I think the necessity of needing to engage local teams to get things done has diluted a lot of the anxiety around doing so. And I think that, when people discover, oh, actually it works to engage this one person to represent us here, maybe it would work if we therefore built a team as an outsourced model in that country. It is removed a lot of truly that anxiety around firms who may think that the only way we can control this properly, the only way we can manage this properly is by doing it ourselves. And we see that a lot. I'm seeing, of course, Sri Lanka was always well known for accounting in this space, Philippines as well, India as well, but we're actually seeing different services being delivered in outsourced or offshored models in different territories now, not only in terms of expansion of capability in certain areas in the subcontinent, for example, where we're seeing teams that are being trained up by companies here in Australia to perform back office services for them at a far more cost-effective, far more profitable basis. But we're also seeing new areas being innovated upon in those territories themselves. So I have no doubt this is the way the world is heading. It's almost, especially with, if you look at the cost of people in Australia, trying to build a scalable business here in Australia is an extraordinarily expensive prospect. You need to utilize the resources that are available to you, and that this COVID has made that process a lot closer to home.
Thank you very much. And on that note, Vinu has a final video for us for just 2 minutes, and then I will end up with a vote of thanks. Vinu, over to you.
Today, technology and digitization is changing the world, providing businesses with a myriad of opportunities previously unavailable. A huge opportunity that technology and the internet can now facilitate is the access to talent globally. Geographical boundaries are no longer a challenge, and the world is in your reach. You truly have access to global talent. You can now have your calls answered in the Philippines, your legal work done in India, and your accounting in Sri Lanka. Why Sri Lanka though? Here's what the Australian says. Some countries have oil, others sit on vast deposits of ore. Now Sri Lanka is striving to capitalize on its own bountiful resource, a mountain of accountants. Indeed, some suggest that accounting is now embedded in the national DNA. Did you know that Sri Lanka has the highest number of UK qualified accountants in the world outside of the UK? That the London Stock Exchange, HSBC, WNS, IFS, and Motorola all have back office centers in Sri Lanka? How about the fact that Sri Lanka's overall infrastructure score is higher than India and the Philippines? Or that Sri Lanka's tertiary education system is ranked among the best in Asia? And in terms of personal security, Sri Lanka is safer than the UK, India, and Philippines with 0 work stoppages. A.T. Kearney concluded that Sri Lanka is a hidden gem for outsourcing. Today, this gem need no longer be hidden. You are in on the secret. And you truly have global access to Sri Lanka's rich talent pool. And here's how to tap into this rich pool of accounting talent. An extended office right here in Sri Lanka. And it's not just a rich talent pool, it's a pathway to reach world-class standards in the finance function through process reengineering, automation, governance, and best practices. Your extended office team in Sri Lanka will work with you in partnership and help you achieve truly world-class standards with measurable KPIs which are benchmarked and monitored throughout your journey to excellence. So whether it's access to the best talent or the quest for world-class standards, an extended office in Sri Lanka is your solution.
We've come, unfortunately, to the end of our panel discussion. Mariam, Blair, Raj, Rajiv, thank you so very much. We are absolutely honored and so grateful to each of you for taking time to grace this panel. Such fascinating thoughts. So much that I learned on people on mental health, on technology, on ethics, on controls. And this is going to leave a lasting impression, I think. A lot of things for me to mull over, and for all of the many people who have joined from different parts of the world. To our participants, thank you all for attending, taking time off your evening. We were delighted to have you. Do please keep in touch. We look forward to many such collaborations, sharing knowledge. And thank you to Vinu, Tarushka, and my team at Informate. A very good evening to you. Please stay safe. Look after yourselves till we meet again. Thank you.
Thank you, Johan and team.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank
Lovely to
you.
meet all of
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.